I remember my great-grandmother, who was a nurse, the one that went to Mount Lowe in 1933. I asked her hundreds of questions, and she came to California. They didn't have a toilet in the house. It was out in the backyard in a pit in Long Beach. So this was pre-plumbing, pre-telephone, pre-electricity, all these things. And she lived through watching man land on the moon in 1969. So to have her tell me what things were like, I think the huge blessing to me is having to have the opportunity to ask all those questions. I wasn't so anxious to go out and play when I could ask what was the war like, or what were the jackrabbits like to eat, and how did you cook them, and stuff like that. And
we love the San Gabriel Valley. There are some amazing people and businesses here, and we think they deserve the spotlight. Welcome to the SGV Master Key Podcast. We'll have on the people that make the SGV great. We'll find out what makes them tick, their ups and downs, their history, and we're going to have fun doing it. This is the SGV Master Key Podcast. And now your hosts, Scott Warmoth and Russell Mano.
All right, SGVers, welcome back to another episode. Thank you for tuning in. If you're a longtime listener, welcome back. We appreciate you spending this time with us. And if you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. We document and share the stories of the people of the San Gabriel Valley, and we're honored to capture the oral history of this place because it is special. If this is the kind of content that you like, don't forget to subscribe. And we release weekly an episode for you, bringing you another guest from right here in the San Gabriel Valley. Well, Scott, one of the things that is featured on our show quite often is this hike that we talk about. And you and I did it this morning. It is February. It's cold. It's windy. And we started at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was sorry, 6:30, right? Mm-hmm. Just as the sun was coming up. And on the hike, I was talking to you about how it's a snapshot of, I think, who you are or who we are, in that people's default is often to seek the path of least resistance, right? And when something is difficult, it's easy to find an excuse not to do it, right? It's too cold, or it's windy today or something. But what do you think it is about you who seeks out this challenge,
Well, I've always thought I have to discipline myself. And that, I guess, some time ago I was thinking, okay, I've been running every day. This was when I was a runner, which I don't do now. But since I was 18, basically, I've run every day, and I never let up. I never stopped. I always tried to get faster and faster, And then I thought, so what was the point of doing that for 30 years if I were to just stop now? It's like there would be no point to having done it, right? So I have to keep going, have to keep moving. It's just something like a life force. Makes you keep doing something, right? Sure.
Yeah, I wondered that question this morning as it was really cold and and windy. Yeah.
It was one of the worst days we've experienced, actually.
Yeah. But we still went, and there's opportunity to say, hey, let's turn back, let's stop, right? But you just keep going, and I still enjoy it. I don't ever leave having finished that hike thinking, oh, you know what, I regret going. I never, that thought never crosses my mind.
No, quite the opposite. When you come back, you always feel good that you did it. But I think today may have been the first time you wore long sleeves.
Because I knew it was going to be windy. That's right. So even in the coldest weather, I will wear a t-shirt because I know it will heat up.
Yeah.
But the wind against a wet body coming down is not good. So
yeah. Well, we both wore shorts as always. And, I've never not worn shorts, no matter how cold, how windy, how brutal the conditions are.
And if you listen to this show regularly, we had a guest on, I believe last week, who Scott laid down the gauntlet, $100 if he can make it up there
in 30 minutes or less.
That's right. And actually, he's scheduled it. So it is set for March 2nd. It's not a race, but it's just to see if he's going to get up there under 30 minutes.
See if I have to pay $100.
So stay tuned for that. We'll have the results of that. But anyway, so Before we get on to our guests, I just want to remind everybody that San Gabriel Valley Now is a source for city news, announcements, events, special savings, and everything SGV. Check them out on Instagram, sgv.now, and read their SGV Now magazine on their website, sgvnow.com. The tie-in to the guests and the hiking is, he's very much involved with preserving the history here, but he's so much more than that. And what's fascinating is the extent of knowledge that he has is just unbelievable. I'm very honored that he's here again. His name is Michael Patris. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, both of you. Appreciate it. And just to give some people some context of how cold it was, the overnight low in the San Gabriel Valley was 39. And when you guys were running at 6:30, it was 42 degrees outside.
Yes, exactly.
So just context, right?
Right. Which I never know, like, what does 42 degrees really mean? You read it, it's okay, it's going to be 42. But yeah, it was cold this morning because the wind. I think, Russell, you said that there were gusts of at least 20 miles an hour,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
sustained was like 8 to 10 and gusts like 20 to 25.
And to get up on the mountain like that, it just I think it's worse than what it might be down in the lower areas.
Yeah.
Definitely colder the higher you go up.
Yeah.
Just a note, because we're talking about temperature, I know what 80, 95, and 100 feel like. I can conceptualize that. I don't know what the lower ones are in Fahrenheit, but I do know in Celsius what 0, -10, -20, -30, -40 feels like.
Yeah, from your Canadian experience.
Yeah, so
there you go.
Like when I read that, I can say, okay, -20, I can go outside still. It's not pleasant, but I can still go outside. Below that, then it starts to get painful.
Sure.
0 is actually pleasant. When you're dealing with those temperatures.
Degrees. Yeah, right. Yeah, so, 0. Yeah, 0 is not like we think.
No.
Right. Yeah.
So, Michael, the first time you were on this show just sort of blew me away. Your knowledge and your what you have captured in the San Gabriel Valley, and I don't even know what direction to go to. We're going to travel to your museum next week to bring some of the listeners some of that. But for those who don't know what you do, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners again?
Sure. So I'm a third-generation native of Southern California. I grew up at the beach, surfed, fished, dove, sailed, all those wonderful things. And I married a woman that didn't like the water. If she sees the water moving in the bathtub, she gets seasick. So I moved to the San Gabriel Valley in 1985, and in the early days, I started hiking up Echo Mountain, San Merrill Trail, stuff like that. And one of the fellows with whom I had hiked is a former LAPD motor officer, and I think it was our third date, my wife and I, and she said a friend of mine who's a motor officer got hit by a DUI driver, and I'd like to visit him at the hospital. So I said, sure. So we go and we hit it off. He was a former Marine, all-around tough guy and great guy as well, and loved antiques and loved history. So he said, when I start getting some of my rehab going, I'd like to start hiking. Would you like to go with me? So I said, yeah, absolutely. So we started the first time on the San Merrill Trail. We hiked up to Echo Mountain. He said, oh, well, there were hotels up here and this and that and the other. And being a third-generation native of Southern California and knowing what I know just through family experiences and then having a good education as well, I did not know about this. And I said, this has to be crazy. There were no hotels up here and a zoo. Are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. So my grandmother was still alive, and my maternal grandmother, and I asked her, I said, Grandma, I said, did you ever hear of a place called Mount Lowe? Oh, yeah, absolutely. We went up there in 1933. I said, okay, I'm game. Now, I was born in 1960, okay? So to give you context, I just turned 63. My grandmother went in 1933. She would have been a teenager then, and they lived in Long Beach. So they took the Pacific Electric Railway red car into Los Angeles. They switched trains. They got on the Pasadena Short Line. They hooked up and went up into Rubio Canyon, went up the incline, went to Echo Mountain, went back to Alpine Tavern. She and her two siblings and her mother, my great-grandmother, whom I knew quite well, shared a Coke and a sandwich there in 1933 and came back. And I said, did you take any pictures? And she looked at me like I had two heads, and she said, take pictures. She said, Michael, we are not a wealthy family. We couldn't afford a camera or film. That's why we shared one sandwich and one Coke, four of us. And it really dawned on me that when the Mount Lowe Railway was built and opened in 1893, that this was really a place for snowbirds. It was a place for East Coasters to come, and it was really for the wealthy. It wasn't for the average individual. And to think about all the people that it took to build that railway, they incorporated in 1891, opened in 1893, they continued to expand into 1894. The workers were making an average of $1 to $1.25 a day. The fare on July 4th, 1893 was $5. It was more than a week's wages. So even the people that built that railway did not have the opportunity to ride it. And it really kind of brought around some context of how we have all these things in Southern California, but really it's not for everybody.
So that was real exclusive.
It was indeed. It was indeed. Now, it wasn't until 1902 when Henry Huntington purchased it and made it part of the Pacific Electric Railway, where he had 1,100 miles of track in L.A., Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties, that he was able to take the loss on the mountain resort because he was making up in freight and passenger traffic. So the fare lowered to its lowest point to $1.25. That was more affordable, but still that was a fair amount of money during those times, and particularly during the Depression. So,
What did it look like at the peak there in 1933? What was there?
So in 1933, and my piece for Show and Tell, whenever you want to introduce that, we can talk about that as well, because the piece is from 1934, so it gives a good snapshot. Okay. There were basically just very few buildings. The first building was the Rubio Pavilion, which was built in Rubio Canyon. It was a hotel that was built 60 feet above a stream bed. And talking about weather, like we were talking about the weather today, in 1893, when this opened, the average rainfall, in the San Gabriel Valley was 24 inches. Okay, so that's a lot of water. And there were 9 waterfalls that were up canyon from where this platform was built, and that generated electricity with a Pelton wheel and put the electricity into storage batteries. So when you guys come to the building, I have an identical Pelton wheel that was used to generate electricity, so you get an idea as far as what that actually means. Once the hotel was built, at the pavilion, they built the incline, which were 2 funiculars, one counterbalanced, the other one would be at the top, and the other would be 3,000 feet below, and they would pass in the middle, and they would bring 30 passengers each. Then, once they got to the top of that, they built a small hotel that the workers were in, that was called the Chalet, and then they built the larger, more grand Echo Mountain House. After that, they built a winding station that had a little gift store, and when you have mechanical things that need to be taken care of, you don't take the train down to L.A. to get it fixed. You have to have a complete shop and a bunch of workers to repair things on the fly as you live up at that mountain at that point. And so there was a casino, which was a dance hall and a gathering place, not a gambling establishment. There were dormitories for workers. So it became its own little city, and then they started to call it the White City on the Mount. And the buildings were painted white, and you could see them during the summertime. But Altadena was very sparsely populated. It was basically agricultural at that time. And, of course, Pasadena was growing from the 1890s in the original Indiana colony. And as it expanded into Altadena, there were more people living along the right-of-way. But once again, these are people that were all basically working-class people who couldn't afford to go on this railway. So it was really interesting that this place was kind of sprouting into its own, and they were hosting over the course of its existence, 1893 to 1936, December, which was the last paid revenue, nearly 3 million passengers. So it was a lot of people, particularly for that day and age.
I saw an image of maybe 6 or 7 men, 6 or 7 women, all dressed up in, looked like Victorian era clothing up there.
Sure.
And I just thought, gosh, that looks so uncomfortable. You know, have you ever seen that image?
I've seen numerous images like that, and something that's kind of a microcosm. I was the firstborn grandchild on my mom's side, and I was the lastborn grandchild on my dad's side. So I had great-great-grandparents, I had great-grandparents, and then, of course, I had my regular grandparents as well. And the thing that I remember most, particularly about the grandparents and the great-grandparents, is whenever they went anywhere, I don't care if it was to the corner drugstore to get ice cream, my grandfather wore a coat and tie and a hat. Same thing with church. If they went on a plane somewhere, which was very rare, they dressed up. And I think it was just a carryover as to how they were raised. And like my maternal grandmother's father built sets at MGM Studios. He was a laborer. He took the Pacific Electric Railway red car up to L.A., got onto the Venice Short Line, went into Culver City, built sets all day, came home the same way. But whenever he went out, he would wear a coat and tie.
So by now the listener must know that you have a wealth of knowledge, but how is it that you've come to acquire this, and how does that up to what you do?
I think probably being an only child and being around a lot of older people gave me a huge opportunity to ask questions. And I remember my great-grandmother, who was a nurse, the one that went to Mount Lowe in 1933, I asked her hundreds of questions, and she came to California with basically a train car, but it was in the baggage section because they couldn't afford first-class seats. It was before the automobile. And when she came here, they didn't have a toilet in the house. It was out in the backyard in a pit in Long Beach. So this was pre-plumbing, pre-telephone, pre-electricity, all these things. And she lived through watching man land on the moon in 1969.
Yeah.
So to have her tell me what things were like was just like being in a movie. It was amazing. And I would pull out photographs from photo albums I'd find. There was a picture of a 1920 Dodge touring car that had a chain of things that looked like a lei, but I couldn't tell what they were, and they were around the hood ornament of the car on the front. And I asked her, I said, what is this hanging around the hood of the car? And she said, oh, well, that was our dinner. I said, what do you mean that's your dinner? And she said, whenever there was daylight, we would drive, but there were no roads then. And they would drive back to Indiana and go to some of these places. There were no street lights. There were no highway lights. So they could only drive when it was light out. The 2-candle power headlights on these cars wasn't enough to illuminate where they were going. And they would, at dusk, shoot jackrabbits. They'd build a fire. They'd eat the jackrabbits, and they'd cut the ears off, and they'd put them on the chain. And that's what was hanging around the radiator ornament, where they'd hang a water bag also. Many old travelers that would go through the deserts and everything would have a flax water bag. Well, they also had the string of jackrabbit ears, and that's how they ate. There were no restaurants. They couldn't bring enough food for 3 weeks of travel. They couldn't even have enough gasoline, hardly. So I think the huge blessing to me is having to have the opportunity to ask all those questions. And I think being an only child particularly, I wasn't so anxious to go out and play when I could ask what was the war like, or what were the jackrabbits like to eat, and how did you cook them, and stuff like that. And I remember my mom admonishing me once, saying, leave great-grandma alone. She doesn't want to answer all these questions. You're interrogating the poor woman. Just leave her alone. And my great-grandmother said, no, I love this. She said, quite frankly, he's the only one in this family who cares about this. And I'm happy to share this. So I think that's kind of how I just started sucking up any amount of knowledge I could. And I'm an avid reader, and I'm always up for new experiences. So I think it's just something innate in me.
What is your title? Like, what do you do, so the listener knows that? How do you refer to yourself?
That's a really good question. So my wife can't answer that question, which is amazing. She's been retired 17 years. And if anybody asks, what does your husband do? She says, oh, ask him. So I own a publishing company called Golden West Books. We publish books on trains and railroads exclusively. That company was founded in 1960 by a man named Donald Duke, who was no blood relation, but was like an uncle to my wife and to myself. And he was a great man. He loved the fact that I started a nonprofit called the Mount Lowe Preservation Society. So that is now 23 years old. It was founded in 2000, and we preserve artifacts, historia, ephemera, photos, memorabilia of the Mount Lowe Railway. But over time, because Henry Huntington pushed through and purchased that line, then we started collecting things from the Pacific Electric Railway. Then it was the Southern Pacific Railroad that took over the PE, so then expanded to that. So now we are basically an archive and a museum, as you will soon see when you visit, of Southern California's transportation evolution. So it's automobiles, it's gasoline and gas stations, it's electric cars, which is a whole other topic for another time. But it's kind of morphed into what have we done as a society. We've got bus materials, we've got car materials, train, trolley, all that good stuff. We have an indoor railroad signal garden, which you will be able to see when you come. We're not quite open to the public yet. We just finished fire sprinklers, which has been a long, ongoing battle, which we're glad to finally be over the hump on. And we've morphed into more than 800,000 images, more than 20,000 three-dimensional artifacts, an 8,000-plus book research library, and
wow, that
countless
is
other pieces.
Incredible. There is something talking about history, and this period, let's say 1870 to 1900 something, is a really fascinating time period. I think they called it the Age of Discovery, if I'm not mistaken.
Certainly.
And I've been reading lately about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, the building of the Panama Canal. It happened in these time periods. And there was the Chicago World's Fair, which I believe was 1893.
That was the World's Columbian Exposition.
Okay, yes, and I read about that, and when I was reading about that, there was a connection to Mount Lowe.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? I was, like dumbstruck when I read that there was some connection to Mount Lowe and that fair or exposition.
So interestingly enough, Thaddeus Lowe had moved to Southern California right about that time, and he went back to visit this place. And he had developed over time, and I guess I'll back up for just a moment. During the American Civil War, he had built 7 balloons to spy on the Confederates for the Union Army. So when you have balloons and you're going out to do aerial reconnaissance, which was very new at that time, he had to have the ability to inflate his balloon. So you just don't pull over with your balloon to a gas station and say, fill her up. You need to figure out a way to sustain what they call a charge in the envelope of the balloon. So he dealt with ammonia gas. That was a failure, and he accidentally made ice. So he would go revisit that after the war and have refrigerator cars for railroads, and he was making artificial ice for pay. This man had no more than a 4th grade education, had more than 200 patents to his name, and it was during these discoveries of heating and illuminating gas that he was awarded a medal from the Franklin Institute, which is obviously an institute of higher learning, and it was through that he ended up going back to the World's Columbian Exposition. So at that time, he was talking about heating and electrifying and things of that nature because gas was a good thing, but electricity was kind of new. And then he saw what General Electric had built. It was a 15-foot tall, 3 million candle power light. It was the largest searchlight ever built. And it was put on top of a tower, and they would shine it at night, and it was a marvel. So over time, that closed in 1893. The exposition would then move to San Francisco, and that was the Midwinter's Exposition. That light went there and was on top of the Bonet Tower. And then after that, Thaddeus Lowe said, you know what are you going to do with that light when you're done with it? And we don't know, it's just a PR piece. And he said, I'd like to have it. I want to mount it on Echo Mountain, and I want to shine it in the valley below so everybody in the San Gabriel Valley knows to come up here and see what we've got going. And indeed, that is what ended up happening. So I assume that was the reference that you were making to Thaddeus Lowe visiting.
It must have been. I wish I had kept it because I should have, brought it to your attention. But yes, it was. I believe it was Thaddeus Lowe. Yeah, that was the connection.
Did the light make it there?
It did. So the light ended up being downslope from Echo Mountain. So when you would go into Rubio Canyon and then you'd go up the incline, there was the station at Echo Mountain. And over time, there were the 2 hotels. There was the winding station, and it was a little bit downslope so it could shine down below and everybody could see it. And I've actually interviewed people that had seen that as a child and not known what it was. And oh my gosh, there's this. And at night, no streetlights or anything back in those days, right? You see this huge light and you go, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so George Wharton James, who was the unofficial publicist for the Mount Lowe Railway and dear friends of Thaddeus Lowe, said that the light was so bright that you could be in Avalon at night and read the paper from the light from Echo Mountain. Now, of course, we know that's not true. But to use that as kind of a PR tool or a hook to get somebody to want to go see this light was great. So what happened when they had the first disaster on Echo Mountain and the winding station burnt down because it was all wood, they rebuilt another one out of all cement and rock, and they ended up putting that 15-foot searchlight on top of the winding station. So when you see the typical Mount Lowe Railway souvenir photographs that were shot by Charles Lawrence, he could send them anywhere in the United States for a quarter. They called him 2-Bit Charlie. You could see the searchlight in 90% of the photos that he shot over the course of the years. And what happened when it got abandoned, after the war, all the war effort, the steel was getting scrapped and sold and put into battleships and all that stuff. That winding station caught fire. The searchlight fell from the top, second floor level, down into the basement. And the Forest Service in the late 50s, early 60s called it what attorneys call an attractive nuisance. And they dynamited the place. And so there's nothing left of that searchlight today. And GE doesn't even have blueprints. So it's
sucks.
completely gone.
If you're wondering what Avalon is the city and harbor on Catalina Island, which is off the coast of Southern California. Interestingly enough, on our hike this morning, we could see it. We could see Avalon. Sorry, not Avalon. We could see Catalina from the hike. But
yeah, the winds had blown the skies very clear.
Completely clear.
What is your favorite era in terms of looking back?
That's trying to ask who's your favorite child. My wife and I don't have children, but
I know who your parents' favorite child was.
At least we hope we do, right?
Yeah, right.
They're both gone now, so we can't ask. But you know, it varies. It varies. I love everything. I'm really fascinated with Egyptology. I love the Victorian era. I love the beginning of automobiles. I just am a lover of all time. It's all fascinating to me. There's not anything that I just find not interesting. I just soak it up like a sponge.
So Egyptology would be quite different from the Victorian era.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's quite a...
But there was Egyptian revival after 1900, and there were a lot of jewelry makers that started emulating artifacts that had been found in pharaohs' tombs and things of that nature.
I kind of, think like in the 1910s or 20s, you see a lot of that kind of influence, right?
Scarabs and things of that nature, certainly.
That sort of spurred the exploration on Catalina Island, too. I don't know if you know that story. A gentleman was digging up, artifacts on Catalina Island. He was getting funding to do more because of the explosion in Egypt, and it never really went anywhere. There's a section on Avalon dedicated to this man. There's some controversy about him, but that the things being discovered in Egypt started a whole lot of places around the U.S. Yeah.
Well, and the thing that's interesting is there are pyramid shapes in Central and South America. There are some in China. So this wasn't unique to Egypt or that region. So it's really interesting, and I think we need to do far more study. But some people are thinking that some of the more modern, sleek pyramids that we see now were the last of the pyramids, clearly because they've been more refined. But there is another group saying that these were actually the first of the pyramids, and the ones that we find in Central and South America and even Mexico actually predate those. Interesting to think about.
Yeah, and have you ever seen imagery of South America jungle landscape through radar imaging that can penetrate and give you a lay of the land? Now they can see all these intricate cities underneath the jungle that they could never see before.
Yes.
They can just, look from above, which is quite amazing.
It's very amazing.
The mound builders in North America, have you heard of them?
Yes.
There's these 10-ton stones that are placed so perfectly, and modern day masons, they don't even know how they can do that.
Where are those?
They're all over Northeast America, Boston, Ohio, up there, but they're incredible. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you have to wonder. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think I'm pretty mainstream thinking with most people. But you have to wonder if we're the top of the food chain. Was there something else that pre-existed or existed at some point that either shared, imparted, or constructed some of these things, because there's just no way that you can figure this out. Even look at Stonehenge. I mean, all those stones came from so far away. They had to be transported. And how they were cut and moved, like you say, modern stonemasons can't figure it out. So, with all the modern technology that we have today, how were we able to do that so well then?
Yeah, and polygonal masonry, we can't do that. Polygonal masonry, where like the stones are perfectly fitted, where you can't insert a paper in it, and they're not poured. It's actually, and there's no mortar, and they're polyagonal, right? But these walls have stood for centuries. And what's amazing is that the polyagonal design actually withstands earthquake. So like if you had them just brick by brick, they would crumble. But because they're all these various shapes, they can withstand these forces of nature. And we can't even replicate that today. It's really amazing. Well, Michael, we ask each guest to bring an item of significance. What did you bring with you this time?
So what I have today, we're talking about the 1930s, is a Sam Hyde Harris, what is called a maquette. So this is a study of what would eventually become a larger piece of art. And the larger piece of art was going to be a mural near 4th and Broadway in downtown LA on a 5-story building. So this ended up existing. This is just a study that Sam Hyde Harris did. And for those that don't know, Sam Hyde Harris was born in the UK in the 1880s, came to the United States just after the turn of the century, about maybe 1903, 1904. He was a teenager then, probably 14 or 15 years of age. And he was a plein air artist, which meant that he wanted to go paint outdoors and paint landscapes and things of that nature out in the open. And if anybody knows anything about Pasadena history, there's a lot of Pasadena plein air work that he had completed. He was part of the WPA projects, the Works Progress Administration, that was begun by FDR. And this particular piece was a study working for the Pacific Electric Railway, who at that time was owned by the Southern Pacific Railroad. He did many railroad murals and was very known for doing this. And this I found in Maine like 30 years ago, and I was just attracted because it said Mount Lowe.
You found this in Maine?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
And it was at a tag sale, which they call a flea market out here. And I bought it for $40 and did not know it was a Harris. And I had it, and I got it framed, and I've had it in a few shows at the Pasadena Museum of History and other locations. And a woman named Maureen St. Gaudens, who was the administrator of Sam Hyde Harris's estate and herself an artist and has written the comprehensive book on his life, said, "That's a Harris." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, that was a mural in downtown LA." And she started pulling out facts and figures. And so it was just one of those fortuitous things. I get attracted by something, and I don't buy it because it has intrinsic value. I just buy it because it makes me smile, or it's part of a bigger story. And because it was Mount Lowe, it was part of my bigger story.
Did you know when you saw it where that was shot from?
So interestingly enough, this is a composite of 3 locations. So the San Gabriel Valley below, which they portray there, is actually from Inspiration Point. And Alpine Tavern would be kind of northwest of Inspiration Point, about 1.5 miles by road. And there was a trail then, but it's a fire road now for LA County Fire. And the mountains and the tree on the left represent Granite Gate. So it's a composite image that is what they call artistic license to try to make it an attractive mural and make people want to go experience that place.
What is the collection of buildings there?
That's called Alpine Tavern. So it looks like a collection, but it's actually a 3-wing structure that was hotels, photo development for the photographer, a gift store, billiards, restaurant, things of that nature.
And that's what was at the top of Mount Lowe, or
that
where was
3
that?
miles back from Echo Mountain by train, but below the peak of Mount Lowe.
Okay.
So the actual peak of Mount Lowe was named for Thaddeus Lowe by, I'm going to have a brain fade. I'll come back to it in a minute. It's funny, it happens occasionally.
Yes.
So Thaddeus Lowe wanted to build to the actual peak of Mount Lowe.
Rand McNally.
Thank you, Rand McNally. So back to that. Formerly, Mount Lowe was called Oak Mountain. Andrew McNally of the Rand McNally Map Company was the one who said, Thaddeus Lowe has done so much for the community, we really ought to name this Mount Lowe. So the goal was to get there. They stopped at Crystal Springs, which was a natural source of water, still is today, and that's where they built the tavern because by 1894 they had run out of money. They were going into receivership. They never made it to the actual peak of the newly named Mount Lowe.
And so I was speaking to him before the show of where that tavern is, and the only place that I know of that area is there's a campground now, and there are cement slabs there, but not much of anything else. And he said that's where the location was.
That
right?
was where the tavern existed, yes. And those cement floors were the basement of the hotel. So that was the ground level where the trolley would come in. You would get off the trolley car and you would go up numerous steps and you would walk into the grand entrance. There was a gift store, restaurant, lobby check-in, all that good stuff there. And then all the rooms were to the sides, and then above that on another level, and then there were housekeeping cottages on the outside perimeter as well.
Okay, so wait a minute. I better get clear on this. So when we go up Echo Mountain,
yes,
and we reach the top of that trail,
yes, San Merrill
is
Trail.
that Alpine?
No, that
Okay.
is Echo Mountain.
Okay.
And that is the beginning of the Alpine Division Railroad. So there were 3 railways there. There was the Pacific Electric Railway, which came into Rubio Canyon, and that was a standard gauge railroad, just like normal streetcars that you would see on the street. You would get off of that on the platform at Rubio. You would get onto the incline car. That would take you up the mountain, and then you would detrain or get off the incline car, and you would be on Echo Mountain. At the heyday, early heyday, there were 2 hotels there. There was the Chalet, which was the small hotel, and then there was Echo Mountain House, which was the larger. And in January of 1900, Echo Mountain House, the big room hotel, burned to the ground, and that was never rebuilt. And then the other one burned also. The Chalet was burned as well. So after about late teens, there was nothing to see up there as far as anything. You just got off onto the top of the incline, and then you got on the next train, which was a narrow gauge train, and there were 3 in tandem, and those would take you back to Alpine Tavern, and that was another 3 miles back.
And Alpine Tavern is where your grandmother went?
Correct.
Okay. So she would have still changed trains?
Yes, exactly.
But there would have been nothing there at that time?
Correct.
Okay. I didn't realize that there was a third train.
Yes.
Or train is the right, or what is the right?
It's a trolley.
Trolley.
Yeah, train trolley. Yep.
Yeah.
And today I think it exists as Mount Lowe campsite or something like that.
Correct.
It's a challenge to get there. You can go on the Fire Road or you can go up Castle Trail. The challenge is not really getting there, though. The challenge is water.
Sure.
Because there's no water source. So if you're going to, however long you intend to stay there, you also have to hike in your water. So I don't see scouts doing more than a night there. It's tough.
So what we have done with the scouts, I have volunteered with the scouts and we've done a couple of things, and I've not spent the night with them. They do that. But we've had Eagle Scout candidates that have needed to get a few badges. And what we do is we go up the Sam Merrill Trail. We do trash pickup and that type of stuff for community service. We stop at Echo Mountain and do knot tying. So anybody who needs to get their knot tying badge done, we do that. And then we hike back to Alpine Tavern, and then we do a few things back there as well. So what happens over the course of the day is we're gone basically 12 to 14 hours, and we go over to Inspiration Point, down Castle Canyon Trail, and then back down to the top of Alta Loma and Lake. And there's a badge, and I can't recall which one it was. I was in Indian Guides. I wasn't in the Boy Scouts. But if you hike more than, is it 10 or 12 miles in a single day, there's a badge for that? Or
I believe it's 20.
20 miles?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I mean, there's different
levels.
I may be wrong. Sorry.
I was thinking 12 miles for some reason, because it ended up being about a 13 or 14 mile hike all day long.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'd love to get in more about your museum, and I'm excited, to go visit there again. But let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
At Wormouth Law, they believe that just because you speak a foreign language, come from a different culture, or simply don't know how to navigate the legal system, that should not prevent you from compensation from injury or receiving benefits. Their multicultural staff have been helping SGVers like you for over 38 years. Visit law888.com or call them at 626-784-7017 and tell them you heard about them on this podcast.
All right, we're back with Michael Patris. Michael, before we go on, we're going to go on to a segment where we ask questions from this card game. This is a segment that we've been doing on this show since we had the creator of these cards as a guest on the show. The cards are Like You cards, and they're just conversation pieces. You can choose to answer one, two, or none of them if you wish. So They're just lighthearted questions. Maybe not so lighthearted last time. Okay, here we go. So the cards are Like You. Question number 1. What skill would you like to master? Question number 2, would you rather stay up all night to finish a project or wake up early to complete it?
Boy. So I am one to stay up all night to complete a project.
Okay.
Sleep for 30 minutes to an hour, and then go back at it to make sure that it is completely done. So when I work on manuscripts, I typically do not edit my own work, but I do multiple edits before I give it to my editor. So there will be virtually nothing to do. But I don't know it all. None of us do. I always want to try to master any skill that I have. If you're not learning, you're dying in my book. And there's always new ways to learn to do new things. I speak Spanish fluently, but there are a lot of words I don't know. So I would like to perfect my vocabulary or get it at least advanced to where I can be better at doing what I do. So yeah, both of those.
Okay. What skill would I like to master? I would like to master Japanese wood joinery.
Wow.
Yeah. I would
Chisels only.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Just something that I could create that's last a long time, something that I could express myself creatively and like that's tangible. That's what I would like to do. Something, that would serve me into my later years. I could do with my wife or yeah.
Wow, that's
nice.
Fascinating. I cannot think of a skill. When I hear skill, I tend to think of doing something with your hands. It's more something I've never been good at. So, but you mentioned learning a language. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a skill, and that seems like a pretty worthwhile one. Yeah, I can't think, but yeah, I can't answer either question, to be honest.
But in a way you have.
Yeah, I guess I have.
If you could speak a language fluently, what would it be?
Either Spanish or Mandarin.
Okay. Well, so back to you, Michael. We've mentioned this museum and the things that are in it. We're going to go visit it. Why don't you share with the listener more about that?
Sure. So we have a 14,000 square foot building on a third of an acre in East Pasadena, formerly known as Lamanda Park. And we are working on making this an operable and workable, functional museum. We have our publishing company there. We have our collections there. Like I mentioned earlier, we just finished fire sprinklers, so we yet have an elevator to add. We hope to be open in late 2024. And we have space for conferences, and we will be doing fundraising dinners there. We're going to be working on a kitchen soon, break room. And I think that because my wife and I have no children, it'll be something that our estate will perpetuate the care for after we're gone. So this isn't just about me. I'm the intermittent caregiver of these things, and my name will never appear on this. That it's not ego-driven at all. It's just something that it's important to the Southern California community at large, and I want it to be preserved and available for future generations.
Yeah, I went there. I was lucky enough to be invited.
You both have been there.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And I didn't expect all the things that I saw in there. It was amazing.
I mean, cars. And it's an amazing exhibit. And I really am waiting for it to open to the public because that's something that people need to see. And
Thank
I
you.
suppose you have private showings here and there.
I do. I'm kind of an odd duck, and you've probably already figured that out, probably from the first visit, probably from the first 10 minutes of the first visit. But I've been putting this thing together, and I've been doing basically everything myself. And I started working when I was 14, and I've just always been a doer. And I don't ask anybody to do for me what I cannot do myself. So that being said, and all of the financial investment that has gone into it at this time. I'm going to have to call Uncle in a few minutes. I mean, it's just, it has gotten to the point to where just between ADA compliance, fire sprinklers were not on our radar in the beginning, and the city of Pasadena said they will be now. And we have to have an elevator, even though there not be public access to the second floor. So I'm going to have to start soliciting some donors and trying to figure out a way to navigate through those waters. I would never ask anybody personally, but I know there are people that are advancement directors and try to get donors to put in and help move things forward, particularly when it's for a community project. So I think that is going to be the next chapter. When you come and see how much we have done, the ADA compliant bathrooms are done other than hanging the stall doors in the bathrooms. We finished out a lot of spaces, and there's a lot more to see. I think you'll be impressed with the progress we've made, but there's a little bit more to do before we're completely over the hump.
And you said your name will not be on it.
No.
Why is that?
Because it's not about me. It's just not about me. I mean, I happen to be the guy with the idea, but if somebody comes along and says, I want this to be called Warmouth Hall, if you want to be the donor to get us over the hump and finish these projects, God bless you. I'm happy to have a donor put their name on something. I know they do that in real life, and I don't think that I've done anything that's so significant. I mean, I've written numerous articles and books and things of that nature, but I think anybody that has a passion for a specific thing can talk about it effortlessly. I've had people talk to me and say, my God, you lectured at Caltech for the emeritus professors, and there were 200 people for a sit-down dinner, and you didn't have one note in front of you, and you spoke for an hour and a half, and we had 30 minutes of follow-up questions. Where do you teach? And I said, well, I don't teach. I'm not a teacher. Well, you're missing your calling. And I said, I don't think I'm missing my calling. I think I just share it in a different way. And anybody that's passionate about anything gets enjoyment, gets the ability to talk about it if asked, and sometimes you have to say, okay, Michael, our hour's over, now shut up.
Well, that is going to be such an asset to the community. And I like what you said about having functions there, that it will be a place for the community to gather, aside from coming to see the incredible, displays that are there. But yes, this other part of allowing the community, allowing this to be part of the community. Oh, that's great. The sooner it happens, the better. I mean, that is.
I agree. Thank you.
Would you, don't be modest, but how would you compare what you have compiled there with some of the other museums that you see in Pasadena?
Well, it's hard to compare because we're different, we're smaller. As far as railroad museums go, we don't have live trains that you can ride on, so we don't have what we call rolling stock. We're not the Huntington Library. We don't have $1 billion endowment, and we don't have Henry Huntington as our founder, so we don't have the attraction that Huntington Gardens and Library has. So we will never be that. They have a lot of amazing things. They have a lot of amazing transportation things that aren't widely known. Pasadena Museum of History, I've guest curated numerous shows. There are maybe 10, 12 shows for them. And I get a gallery and I put together 300, 400, 500 items. We get about 3,000 people in a 6-month period, 2,500. And it's something that I accompany with lectures because I'm passionate about it. I do like to share it. And frankly, if I can't interest anybody younger than myself in this, there's no future for it. So I have to find how this ties in to all of our lives. Public transportation is something that everybody has experienced at some point in time or other. Automobiles, we've all experienced that. I have a new collection of thing called Autoettes, which we'll talk about at a future date. I don't want to get into it now, but that's something that is little known, and it's something that really has been part of all of our past, and nobody really realizes it. So I think that by opening this up to the community at large, not having membership fees, just making this available, not 24/7, but having it available for the community to have dinners, have the mayor come and talk about the state of East Pasadena or something like that. I think it would just benefit everybody. And to be able to see some of the things that we've accumulated that you would not normally see. We have artifacts from the Civil War. We have ribbon that was on Abraham Lincoln's casket when it was lying in state in Washington, D.C., that Thaddeus Lowe personally took off of the casket, had framed, and has been in his family until it was donated to us recently. I mean, that's something you just don't get to see everywhere. I mean, the Smithsonian may have one, and out in Redlands, they have a great Lincoln Library and Museum out there, so they may have one. But other than that, where are you going to see something like this?
Would you be open to, maybe third grade classes coming to view the museum, on a regular annual outing, let's say?
So yes, I would love to engage the community. We are a nonprofit educational foundation. That's what our 501c3 is. We're all about education. I think third grade might be a little early. I think that I might want to make it a little bit later just because of what exists and the understanding. Not a lot of third graders know about the Civil War or balloons or any of that, so I think that would be an early introduction, certainly, but it might not file or register with them right away. I think certainly seeing railroad signals go ding, 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 ding would be great for kids. I know that there is a railroad merit badge with the Boy Scouts and railroad signals, and I would love to host the Boy Scouts for having their Eagle Scout candidates get their Eagle badge in our garage area with all the railroad signals. I mean, there's a ton of education that's just sitting there. I mean, you can walk in, look, and you've been there, you kind of know. It's changed a little bit. In my opinion, it's gotten better. But because we've had to put in fire sprinklers and boom lifts and all this stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's accumulated into the gallery space that needs to be reshuttled out, and that needs to be cleared. Eventually, I want to have fundraising dinners there, and I want to seat like 160 people. So there's got to be some housekeeping done first.
I love your passion for what you do, and the vision for what it will become. And I definitely hope that it gets there. Just listening to you and hearing how you would approach your grandmother and ask her these questions, there's such a value to the passing on of knowledge that almost can't be captured any other way. When I was speaking to my wife about, let's say, another country where they only push a certain type of knowledge and the trades are being downgraded, the knowledge of those craftsmen and even, let's say, farmers who understood when the weather looked a certain way or when the animal looks like this is what it means. That type of knowledge is so valuable, and it's learned over generations.
Absolutely.
But you can't just, how do you capture that? How do you pass that on? And these sorts of things are so really important to the fabric of the community.
I think so. And I will answer that kind of with something funny that happened in my own family. My parents divorced when I was 13, and my father demanded that I live with him, and I did until I was 18, and then I moved out. And my dad said, you're going to be doing the cooking because I bought the house, and you have to go to school, and you have to contribute your end of this. So I started cooking, and I love to cook. I always loved to cook. And I got recipes from my great-grandmother. And there was a leg of lamb recipe that one of my cousins came across, and she called me and she said, Michael, she said, I have this leg of lamb recipe and I don't understand it. She said, what's up with this? And I said, well, what don't you understand? And it was rubbing the leg of lamb with herbs and putting rosemary in and putting Marsala wine. And then it says to cut 6 inches off the narrow end of the leg. And she says, why do you cut 6 inches off the narrow end of the leg? I said, well, that's a really good question. I never really questioned that. I never cut any part of the bone off. So I'll call my mom. So I called my mom and said, Mom, great-grandma's recipe for leg of lamb. Got to cut 6 inches off the leg. What's that about? She says, oh, you know what? I don't know. Call your grandmother. My grandmother was still around at that time. So I called Grandma and asked her, and she laughed, and she says, oh, Mr. Know-It-All. Yeah, call your great-aunt. She says, you ask her why you cut off 6 inches off that leg. And I said, all right. And my great aunt was a former missionary in Kenya for 48 years. So stories galore that I asked endlessly when she was around. And so I called my Aunt Geneva and I said, Geneva, I said, your mom's recipe for a leg of lamb, I said, cut 6 inches off the narrow end of bone off. Why is that? She laughed like she was sitting in front of Don Rickles. She was hysterical. And she said, "Oh, Michael, I can't believe this. All the things we've talked about, all the years I've known you. Oh my God, I wish Mother were alive." She would just, she would just go nuts for this. Why do you cut 6 inches off? Because it won't fit in the oven. It's too long. Had nothing to do with anything. Right. But look how it brought the entire family together. So we have this famous leg of lamb recipe and cut 6 inches off the bone.
Wow.
That's funny. I actually thought it was so you could access the marrow for the recipe, but...
Yeah. No,
I thought it would be something like, well, in Grandma's kitchen at that time, it would be something related to
and her
that
stove
moment at that place. Yeah.
Sure. She, in 1933, the Great Long Beach earthquake, their house was the only house to not come off its foundation. Why? Because my great-grandfather worked at the studios, and on the weekends, he'd take his car up and get all the scrap lumber and bring it back to his house. He had crawled under the house to fix some plumbing, and he thought, this is the weirdest thing. He says, this is a house on a raised foundation, and the house is not attached to the foundation.
Oh, wow.
It's just sitting there. If there were a big earthquake, it could slide right off. So he did all this cross bracing, and he attached the house, and then, of course, 1933 earthquake comes. Their house is the only house that's not off its foundation in Long Beach. That was on 3rd and Roswell Streets, right on the corner. House is still there. In fact, it just sold for over $1 million, which my family would just go, "Oh my God, that bungalow!" And I think they paid like $9,700 for it in like 1917 or something like that. And that was a stretch. They had a mortgage. It just, he worked at the studios and built sets. So yeah, crazy.
Well, I have no doubt that there are endless stories that we can go into, but we have to move the show along. So we're going to get into some of the things that you enjoy in the San Gabriel Valley, a new set of those things.
I don't remember what your last 3 were, but the SGV3, of course, is a part of our podcast here. So what are 3 of your favorite things?
Well, I have to repeat at least one, and that's the Mount Lowe Railway.
Yeah, of course.
Got to do that. I'm going to add the Mount Wilson observatories because, as we briefly touched on, I am co-authoring a book that's going to be out later this year with Arcadia Publishing, co-authored with Maggie Sharma on the Mount Wilson observatories. And it turns out that our archive had several thousand images that were going to be used in the book. So Mount Wilson Observatory. And the third I'm going to say is the San Gabriel Mission. I mean, what an amazing relic that's still functional. My wife graduated there in 1971. She was the last co-ed class there. And all the stories of how that was so integral of the community in those days. And that is not even the original location of it. It was originally located somewhere else.
Was it?
I didn't even know that.
Oh, yes, it was. Now, I know you have a San Gabriel episode coming up, so I'm not going to kill it for somebody else. I will let them tell you about that. So those are my 3.
Oh, that has already passed. That's Terry Huerta.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but we're going to go visit to shoot there. But yeah, I don't think she mentioned that.
I don't remember that. I don't remember hearing that. She might have.
It was further south, near where Potrero Grande is, near the 60 freeway, and it got flooded out.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I've never heard that story. Speaking of the observatories, a previous guest said that there were 2 in the San Gabriel Valley. We'll say Wilson is in the San Gabriel Valley because who else lays claim to it, right?
Yeah.
The Griffith Observatory, and then Michael, right on cue, was like, "Oh yeah, I know where that is."
Monterey Park.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And every Wednesday night at 7:30, it's open to the public.
Oh, I think that's what he said, right?
In fact, that was Henry.
Peter Chen.
That was Peter Chen.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Former mayor.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming back on our show and sharing, all of your knowledge and stories with us and our listeners. If people want to get a hold of you, contribute in any way, how can they get in touch with you?
So our website is www.mountlowe.org, and that's the best way to reach us. We have a donation button on that website, and it shows a lot of our artifacts, some of our previously displayed guest curatorial roles, and shortly we'll be adding things to show what the updates are on the building.
Wonderful. Well, Michael, I really enjoyed this time. I hope that our listeners did as well. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you both for having me. Thank you, Russell, and thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. There's another episode for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out the full catalog of episodes on our website, sgvmasterkey.com. There is another episode of Michael in there. I'm sure on the video portion of the show, there'll be a link there. But thanks again for tuning in. And until next week, we'll see you then.
You've been listening to the SGV Master Key Podcast. Our passion is the small businesses and the people that make up the San Gabriel Valley, and it's our honor to have them on the show. We hope you've enjoyed it. Make sure to like, rate, and review. The show is produced by Russell Mano, edited by Victoria Allers of Kind Monster Productions. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the SGV Master Key Podcast.
Mother, no, kind of mother.